Wes Watson was born in California, and from a very young age, he was surrounded by an environment shaped by violence, gangs, and street crime. Growing up in a neighborhood where respect was measured by force and reputation was built on fear, left an indelible mark on his character. As a teenager, Watson began searching for his place in a world that seemed to offer him no options. Soon, he discovered that his imposing physique and defiant attitude opened doors that for others remained shut. D.O. Less with more focus, doing less, I told you. Yet, behind that facade of confidence and toughness, there was a deep emptiness. A mix of insecurity and a need for validation that pushed him toward increasingly risky decisions. Every small achievement or victory in his immediate environment became fuel to feed a personal narrative of power and control. But in reality, his life moved forward in a chaotic way, marked by arrests, fights, and constant confrontations with the law. During his first years in prison, Watson found himself in a completely different world. A place where survival didn't depend only on physical strength, but on the ability to read others, anticipate moves, and build strategic alliances. It was there that his personality began to take a more calculated form, learning to project an image of absolute dominance and control while hiding the emotional wounds he carried from childhood. Every day behind bars was a lesson in extreme discipline and adaptation, an involuntary laboratory where he developed skills that would later be essential for building his online presence as an undisputed alpha male. Watson started studying those around him, imitating behaviors of power and authority, and realizing that perception could be manipulated as effectively as brute force. Prison, which for many was a place of destruction, became for him fertile ground, where his life strategy was born. A mix of physical intensity, motivational speech, and an appearance of invincibility. When he got out, Watson threw himself into the world with the intention of translating that image, built behind bars, into a platform that would give him recognition and admiration. Social media. His first posts, filled with motivational phrases and extreme life advice, showed a man who was tough, disciplined, and dominant. Someone who seemed to have all the answers. How to be strong, respected, and successful. Thousands of followers began admiring him, believing in the authenticity of his stories and the clarity of his message. However, behind the cameras, reality was much more complex. The man who inspired discipline and toughness also faced his own doubts, fears, and contradictions. Every carefully edited post, every intense video, and every extreme workout were part of a script that built his personal myth, a facade designed to impress and attract more than a true reflection of his real life. Watson's charisma, combined with his impressive physique and his ability to communicate authority, allowed him to quickly consolidate a loyal group of followers. They saw in him an example of overcoming adversity through strength and resilience. His criminal past, his time in prison, and his extreme training methods became a fascination for those looking for inspiration, but also created an aura of mystery around him. As his popularity grew, so did the pressure to maintain that image of invincibility. This pushed him to intensify his speeches and polish every detail of his digital narrative. The line between the real person and the character he had created started to blur. But for his followers, Wes Watson had become the very definition of the alpha male, someone who seemed to live at a level of strength and discipline unreachable for most. As Wes Watson consolidated his social media presence, his image of unbreakable strength and extreme discipline turned into a double-edged sword. The audience that once followed him with admiration not only expected to see intense training and aggressive life advice, but also demanded complete consistency between what he showed and how he actually lived. To maintain that perception of invincibility, Watson felt forced to intensify every aspect of his character, from his physical routine to the way he recounted his past. He built a carefully polished story where every detail seemed designed to impress and reinforce his myth. His followers didn't just consume his content, they idealized him, projecting onto him a figure of moral and physical authority, someone who seemed capable of facing any adversity without hesitation. But the pressure of maintaining that image began to generate inner tension. Because the man behind the character couldn't always sustain the level of perfection the narrative demanded. Every day became a delicate balance between the reality of his limitations and the need to project an impossible perfection. The first cracks in his alpha male facade began to appear in how Watson interacted off-camera. Those who knew him personally started noticing contradictions, unexpected vulnerability, moments of doubt or insecurity, and a constant need to reaffirm his authority through words more than actions. While in his videos he spoke of discipline and total control, in real life many of his decisions were driven by the search for approval, validation, and acceptance. His ability to manipulate others' perception was so powerful that even he began to confuse himself. Living partly inside the character he had created to survive and thrive in such a competitive, superficial world. Interviews, collaborations, and public appearances became stages where he had to play a role with no room for error. And every negative comment or doubt from followers or critics felt like a direct attack on the identity he had built with so much effort. Meanwhile, his audience was growing exponentially, and with it, the responsibility to maintain the illusion. Every post, every extreme workout video, and every story of his past life had to be more shocking than the last. This led Watson to exaggerate parts of his story, carefully selecting which moments to present to the public. His narrative about prison, for example, turned into a kind of personal epic, where every conflict and every challenge was told in a way that reinforced the image of a man able to dominate any situation. But behind that heroic tale, there were moments of fear, mistakes, and vulnerability that never appeared on camera. Building his character became a constant, meticulous job, a machine of perception that needed to be fed daily. And any failure, no matter how small, could trigger criticism or put in doubt everything he had built. At the same time, social media revealed a more complex dynamic between reality and the image projected. Platforms designed to reward appearance over authenticity amplified every calculated gesture, every motivational phrase, every display of strength, while hiding or ignoring any sign of weakness. Watson learned to take advantage of this system, but also started living trapped in a cycle where exaggeration and theatricality became the only way to keep his audience's attention. His life turned into a permanent stage where physical training, motivational stories, and the projection of authority were mixed with a strategy carefully designed to maximize impact in followers who couldn't distinguish between the character and the real man. In the middle of this phenomenon, the figure of Wes Watson became admired, questioned, and debated at the same time. Because while his presence commanded respect, the gap between image and reality was becoming increasingly obvious to those who looked with critical eyes. As his fame grew, so did the critical attention to every aspect of his life and his narrative. Followers began comparing what he showed in his videos with testimonies from people who knew him before his rise to digital fame. Slowly, inconsistencies started to appear. Exaggerated stories about his time in prison, tales that presented every confrontation as a total victory, every challenge as an act of absolute dominance. These began to be questioned. While he projected invincibility, those who knew him more closely revealed that many situations were dramatized or reinterpreted to fit into his alpha male script. The line between truth and fiction was blurring, and while his most loyal audience still admired him, signs of falseness began leaking through comments, interviews, and detailed analysis of his story. The pressure to maintain an impeccable narrative pushed him to extremes few could imagine. Every post had to be more impactful than the last, every workout more intense, every story more daring. Watson found himself trapped in a cycle where his own life was subordinated to the construction of a myth. The daily routine he showed as total discipline and control was, in reality, conditioned by the need to create content, to maintain the perception of perfection, and to hide any sign of vulnerability. His impressive physique and motivational speech became tools of spectacle, while his real personal and emotional growth was left in the background, invisible to most of his followers. Reality started clashing with the fiction he had built, and that tension pushed him to increase the intensity of his character with no room for rest or humanity. Criticism multiplied as old acquaintances and former inmates began sharing their own versions of events. Stories that once were part of his heroic narrative were reinterpreted by external voices, revealing a more human, vulnerable, and even contradictory side of Watson. It became clear that many of his tales of absolute dominance, extreme strength, and total control were carefully selected and dramatized constructions, adapted to fit the character he had decided to project online. The reality behind the alpha male figure showed a man with insecurities, mistakes, and contradictions. Someone who used the image of strength as a shield to protect his real identity and to sustain a narrative that gave him admiration and authority in front of millions. This gap between character and person sparked intense debate online. Was Watson truly an example of discipline and overcoming hardship, or simply a master of self-promotion and manipulation of perception? The pressure didn't just come from outside, but from his own mind. Maintaining the illusion of perfection and total control carried a huge emotional and psychological cost. Every video, every motivational message, every extreme routine was confirmation that he had to keep playing his role, even if the real man behind the camera felt fear, doubt, or frustration. The tension between what he showed and what he lived put him at a point where fame became more of a burden than an achievement. The need to sustain his narrative became so imperative that any mistake, any slip, could threaten not only his reputation but the perception of invincibility he had built over years. In the middle of this constant pressure, a clear pattern began to appear. The fascination his audience felt for him was more about the spectacle of his character than the authenticity of his real life. And that realization started to question the very foundation of everything he had built. Over time, reality began to impose itself. Wes Watson's carefully constructed image, the inconsistencies in his stories, the testimonies of those who knew him before fame, and critical analysis of his content began to undermine the perception of invincibility he had projected for years. Attentive followers started noticing that the man behind the character didn't always match the alpha male figure they admired. The strength and discipline that seemed unbreakable were, in many cases, the result of a meticulously planned performance. Every heroic story, every motivational tip, and every display of physical power began to be re-evaluated. The fascination he once sparked was now mixed with growing disappointment. The narrative that had inspired respect and admiration for so long began to show obvious cracks, revealing that the figure presented as the ultimate example of dominance and resilience was, in reality, built on exaggeration, dramatization, and manipulation of perception. As more details came out, The tension between the public character and the real person became unsustainable. Watson, aware that his myth could collapse at any moment, faced a dilemma: continue feeding the illusion and keep his audience's attention, or reveal the truth behind the facade and risk losing the authority and prestige he had built with such effort. The decisions he made reflected the complexity of his situation. On one hand, his need for recognition and admiration pushed him to keep the show going. On the other, the internal pressure and the external questioning forced him to confront the gap between what he projected and what he really was. Every post, every video, every public appearance became a calculated act, a constant attempt to balance public fascination with the vulnerability he tried to hide. The tension was palpable, and the perception of perfection grew more fragile in the face of evidence leaking out. Finally, the truth began to impose itself irreversibly. Documentaries, interviews, and testimonies exposed details of his life that contrasted with the narrative he had built. Moments of weakness, mistakes made in prison, and impulsive decisions never shown in his videos came to light. The image of an absolute alpha male began to collapse, and many of his followers had to reevaluate the figure they once admired. What once seemed like a story of discipline and resilience turned into an example of how perception can be manipulated, of how a character can be meticulously built to inspire, intimidate, and generate admiration, even when the reality behind the facade is far more complex and human. The fall of the myth didn't necessarily mean that Watson was a total fraud, but it did reveal that the authority and control he projected were largely the product of strategy and theatricality, rather than absolute strength or unbreakable dominance. The impact of these revelations was profound. Many followers felt betrayed, discovering that what they admired was not entirely real. The conversation about Wes Watson shifted from blind admiration to critical reflection about authenticity on social media. His story became an emblematic case of how an image can overshadow reality, how the desire for recognition, validation, and power can lead someone to create a character larger than life. In the end, the lesson for those observing his journey is clear. Perception can be manipulated. Fame can be built on fiction. And the line between reality and character can be so thin that even those living it can end up confused. Wes Watson stopped being just a fitness and discipline influencer. He became a living example of the risks of extreme theatricality and of building a personal myth in a world where appearance often outweighs truth.